Hey everyone. The last lecture kind of finished off the habitat loss, and we're going to move on to overexploitation, which includes overfishing, overhunting, over harvesting of plants. It doesn't have to be an animal. So it's basically the intense harvest of a species or resource that results in decline or loss. So why are species overexploited? When we have more people, we need more resources. That's part of it. We also have more efficient hunting and harvesting methods. So as we increase in technology, that allows us to exploit certain resources more effectively and more efficiently. Lack of information. If you're a hunter or fisher, you probably know that there are certain limits. So you may only be allowed to take home a certain number of fish, or you're only supposed to catch ones of certain sizes. You may, if you're hunting deer, only be allowed to take one of the sexes, so you might only be allowed to take males. And there are these levels that are put in place to protect the resource so that it's available so that you can hunt it year after year after year, or fish year after year after year, without there suddenly being no more left to hunt or fish. So sometimes we don't have a good idea of what a sustainable level of harvest is. So if we don't have a good idea how many there are out in the environment, it's very difficult to put into level what a sustainable harvest would be. This is true especially for marine species, but recently we've been discovering that we don't know a lot about turtles, and there's usually not a limit on turtles, but they live a really long time, and it takes them a long time to get to age at reproduction. So this has been a huge issue that's come up primarily in Arkansas, but a lot of states very recently have been considering whether they need to set sustainable levels of harvest or some kind of restrictions on turtle harvesting. Discount rate is another reason that species are overexploited. So we talked about discount rate before when we were doing our cost-benefit analyses and valuing biodiversity. But if we value the resource right now higher than in the future, there may be more of an economic incentive to overexploit it now rather than conserve it for the future. Finally, supply and demand. So as supply drops, sometimes demand rises and price increases. And that provides an incentive for exploiting something even if it's very rare. And if we're talking about a species, if we keep pursuing it, even though it's rare, it's very likely that it could go extinct. So overexploitation is a huge problem. It often happens in places that have large, poor rural populations. Happens where wildlife is used for food and where traditional medicine is part of the culture. Technology has increased overexploitation a lot, particularly in marine fisheries, but it also means that we can connect markets from all over the world. So if something is endangered in one area, but it's highly sought after in another area, it's not that hard to ship it very efficiently from one place to a next for not very much money. So just some examples here. These are tuna, and some of the larger species of tuna have been overexploited a lot, and so we'll talk about fisheries in particular. This is a pangolin. Some of you may have heard of it, but some of you might not be familiar with it at all. It's basically an anteater with scales, and it's the only mammal that has scales. There's a few different species of them in Africa and Asia. But they're the most trafficked animal in the world, primarily for Chinese medicine. So they harvest these scales. and they have to kill the animal to harvest the scales. These bags here are confiscated pangolin scales, and they grind up the scales and use them for medicine. They're basically made out of fingernails. It's the same material as our fingernails. So there's really no medicinal benefit to taking pangolin scales. It should be the same as eating your own fingernails pretty much. So there's really no science to back up their exploitation for medicinal purposes, but they are being killed in very large numbers and being transported primarily to China. So overexploitation, we looked at this graph earlier. This looks at the percent of threatened species affected by different threats. And you can see that overexploitation is a major threat, primarily for mammals and birds. But there are some plants that suffer a lot from overexploitation as well. And we'll talk about marine fisheries as well. So we see about a quarter of endangered vertebrates in the United States are threatened with overexploitation, and about 3/4 of endangered vertebrates in China are threatened by overexploitation. And so this brings us back to the tragedy of the commons. So remember we talked about that when we were talking about the value of biodiversity. And just a reminder, that is the unregulated use of a common property, so it has to be a common or open access resource that results in its degradation. And basically a few people benefit greatly, but it degrades the resource such that it's not available for everyone. And so the problem is that ecosystems are these common properties often available for free or at very little cost. The best economic choice for each individual is to use as much as possible, but that's not good for the sustainability of that resource. So it might not continue on into the future if these few individuals make their best economic choice. So overexploitation, interestingly, has been occurring for a very long time. It predates modern history and technology. And so this is some really interesting information. There's a lot of studies that suggest that humans caused extinctions of large mammals over the last 100,000 years. So before we had modern societies, people were overexploiting animals, particularly large mammals. So this graph here shows different continents, and it shows the percent survival of large mammal species. So we're talking about things like rhinos and elephants and just things on that magnitude, so very large mammals. And this shows the population of large mammals on each continent, and the arrows show when humans arrived on that continent. And so you can see that if we look at Australia here, the populations of large mammals was very high until people arrived, and then not very long after we had a dramatic decline in large mammals in Australia, and there's only a few left, some of the larger kangaroos. If we look at North America, we see similar things happening. We lost a lot of our large mammals. We still have elk and grizzly bears and black bears and bison, but bison almost went extinct. But you can see not long after people are thought to have arrived in North America, lost a lot of our large mammals. And then we see the same thing in Madagascar, which is a smaller island off the coast of Africa, that not very long after people arrived, we see a dramatic decline in large mammals in Madagascar. Africa is really the only continent that has retained a lot of its large mammals, which is why we find elephants, wildebeest, rhinoceros, giraffes. We have a lot of these very large mammals that are still present in Africa. And they think that that is because humans evolved in Africa. And so they were able to adjust slowly to the increase in people over time. And so as people got smarter and hunted more efficiently and learned to hunt in groups as people became more social, um, it happened gradually, and the animals there were able to adapt to this changing predator over time. And so it does look like Africa lost some large mammal species, but it by far has the highest proportion left. Now, recently, we're starting to see that change, whereas the abundance of large mammals in Africa is much, much smaller than it was 100 or 200 years ago. But they think that that's why we see these different patterns in Africa relative to other continents.